Hi, everyone. Well, we've come to the brink of a bloody board game. Now, I'm not trying to be flippant by saying that World War I was a board game. I simply mean that it was a matter of strategy after strategy on both sides. And in the end, all that really happened was that many hundreds of thousands of young men lost their lives, including women and children and civilians who were not even a part of the war. And so World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. The phrase that always comes to my mind is that the war was supposed to make the world safe for democracy. That phrase actually wasn't used until President Wilson used it in 1917 after he was reelected and inaugurated, and then he saw the writing on the wall. He saw that war may be inevitable. So, did this war make the world safe for democracy? Now, one thing is true. Everyone thought it was going to be a short war, and soldiers were rushing to join the effort for their respective countries. In fact, 6 million soldiers were preparing for battle, moving all over Europe to get ready to fight for Russia or for Germany or for France or for Britain. And they actually were in pretty good spirits, and they came up with marching songs. And one of the most famous is, "Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile." Okay, I had to sing it, sorry. And you may actually know that from the Charlie Brown Halloween special. It's a great pumpkin, Charlie Brown, when Snoopy thinks that he is going to be a World War I flying ace, and he starts marching to that song. Yeah, it's a part of our culture now. But when you think about the fact that these soldiers were being told to smile, and when you understand how terrible this war was, it is a terrible tragedy that's happening before our eyes. So, things started after, this month of getting ready. Things did start pretty quickly, and the Germans had a plan. They figured the French, well, first of all, the Austrians, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was going to fight the Russians in the east, and that would be called the Eastern Front. In the meantime, the Germans decided that they were going to attack the French in the west. And so that was their main objective, and they figured the Austrians could hold off the Russians until they quickly took care of the French. Remember, they had beaten them in the Franco-Prussian War, so they were pretty confident. And the Germans figured that the easiest way to get to the French would be across Belgium and Luxembourg. And those countries were neutral. So they were not going to be a part of the war. They were not fighting. And Great Britain had said that they would defend Belgium's neutrality. So that's a trigger right there. If Germany goes into Belgium, it will bring Britain into the war. But, Germany is gambling. They think, Britain's not going to risk it. They're not going to have that much of a sacrifice just for Belgium. Now, the Germans also thought the French would try and defend Alsace and Lorraine. Remember, those were the provinces that were taken over by the Germans after the Franco-Prussian War. Alsace and Lorraine along the Rhine River. And so they figured, okay, the French are going to put a bunch of their troops there to defend those territories. And so instead, we are going to go up and over instead of across to Alsace and Lorraine. Well, the French did have some troops at Alsace and Lorraine, but they also had troops in Paris. And so that is going to be a problem for the Germans as well. Once the Germans entered Belgium, which they did, it was inevitable, the British entered the war. And it took a little while for them to get involved, though. Remember, they're not on the continent, and the Germans have lots of U-boats. And these U-boats were a serious advantage. Even though the British had the better navy, the Germans had lots of U-boats and could sink British ships. And so there was a slow progress for the British getting into the war. And the Germans were going to take advantage of it. Remember, they could go across, and they headed toward Paris. They wanted to cross the Marne River, and that led to the First Battle of the Marne, and it was an epic battle. On the French side, you had General Joseph Joffre, JJ, okay? Joseph Joffre. And he knew that things looked very gloomy. They were dire for the French. The Germans had a superior military, and they were just rushing across Belgium, and the war would be over by Christmas at that rate. Well, he gave his great speech, and what he told his troops, he said, "Soldiers of France, we are attacking." So he decided that they were going to attack the Germans. "We are attacking. Advance as long as you can. When you can no longer advance, hold your position. When you can no longer hold it, die." And that's his powerful speech. But he didn't just have words. He backed it up with actions. And he marshaled 1,200 taxi cabs from Paris to get troops out to the front lines. It was a miracle on the Marne. It stopped the German advance cold. The Germans, they had gained a lot of ground, but now they realized it was not going to be a quick war. And that was in 1914, August and September 1914. And by Christmas, there were 500 miles of trenches snaking back and forth around the places where the troops had massed together. And so you had two jagged trench lines, and in between it was called no man's land. And that trench warfare would become a stalemate. Again, one of those places where they had the trenches was Flanders, and that was pretty much the British defenses. But there were many places within French territory, because the Germans had advanced and taken some French territory, mostly along rivers. And so you're going to hear us talk about the battle on the Meuse River or the Somme River. Okay, and so the Allies, which are France and Britain mainly right now, Italy is neutral at this point. Basically, those Allied forces are going to try and attack from the south and attack the Ottoman Empire, which had entered the war, along with Bulgaria. Okay, Bulgaria invaded Serbia. Bulgaria basically just wanted more territory for itself. So mainly it's this important sea channel, the Dardanelles, that has to be guarded. And the Ottoman Empire controlled that waterway. Remember that the Ottoman Empire had lasted for 624 years. It was the old man in Europe. That's its nickname. But it was crumbling. It was weaker. So the Allies thought, maybe we can get in. And they fought the Battle of Gallipoli in February of 1915. And unfortunately, it didn't go very well for the Allies. The Ottomans were able to dig in. They had the defensive positions. And over time, it was about a year-long battle, 11 months. Really the longest campaign in the war, although you'll hear me say that one more time. So the Battle of Gallipoli had 200,000 casualties on the Allies' side. And when we say casualties, it includes wounded and also dead. So basically, anybody who got wounded is counted as a casualty, and then many of those also die. How did they die? They died because they couldn't get medical care quickly enough. Gangrene is what happens when you have a wound that doesn't get taken care of. If it gets wet. And so, a lot of times amputations had to happen. And so no more gory details for you. But So the Battle of Gallipoli was a loss for the Allies and a win for the Central Powers. And then Britain knew that it had to do more than just fight with its British Expeditionary Force. The BEF was not enough. Those were the regular soldiers. They were dying right and left. And so Lord Kitchener was in charge of the military in Britain, and he called on volunteers and was able to get 500,000 volunteers. They called them the Kitchener's Army, also Kitchener's Mob, because they were not well trained. They were supposed to train for approximately a year and a half and then enter the war, but they were needed a lot earlier, and as a result, many of them were put in harm's way before they were really ready. So that's a lot of what happened in 1914, 1915, and we're going to see that 1916 is probably the most critical year of all. Now, by now, you will have learned a lot about the technology of World War I. The Industrial Revolution, starting in 1750, produced momentum. You had steam power, you had textile mills, then you had railroads and steamships, you had new kinds of guns, you had the Gatling gun and machine guns, and after that, you also had big guns that could launch huge shells, and those were artillery. So the big guns were a big part of World War I. Well, let's start with something that we always think about around the turn of the 20th century with the Wright brothers developing flight. And flight was such a positive symbol of hope, but it turned into something that had to be used in warfare. And at first, they had airships. There were balloons that were used to survey battlefields, and that was happening already in the Civil War. But airplanes provided a way for, even if you had guns firing up, you could maneuver and get away from danger and still spy on enemy troops. And eventually those airplanes were also used to drop grenades and bombs and had guns to fire at the ground and also at other airplanes. And so that leads us to machine guns. Machine guns were devastating. One machine gun could basically take the place of 50 riflemen and you could do that same work in seconds. Obviously, if both sides have machine guns, kind of cancels out the effect, but you still have thousands and thousands of people dying as a result, just on both sides. In addition, you have the first weapons of mass destruction, poison gas. It started out with chlorine, which is not deadly exactly. It just, makes you blind and things like that. But mustard gas was much worse, and basically it kept escalating and getting worse and worse. The Germans were the first ones to use the gas at the Battle of Verdun, and we will talk about that in just a little bit. Tanks were used first at the Battle of the Somme, and tanks were very important in winning that battle for the Allies. Artillery, as we said, that was just a matter of fact. With this trench warfare, you just have guns shooting and shooting and shooting. In 6 days, 2 million shells would be fired. 2 million shells from one side. So it's just mind-blowing, the scale of this war. You also had a new kind of fortification. Instead of these castles or forts, you had temporary defenses set up with barbed wire, which was an American invention as well. And so barbed wire and trenches formed this spider's web. We're going to talk in a little bit about Lord of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien, along with C.S. Lewis, fought in World War I, and much of their fantasy ideas, many of their fantasy ideas, come from their experiences. And so think of the spiders. Think of spiders' webs, barbed wire, trenches. This is what these soldiers had to go through. So the Battle of Verdun is considered to be the longest battle. Now, Gallipoli, we call it a campaign, and it had different stages, and it was a little bit different because mainly, it started out as a naval operation too. But the Battle of Verdun, as a land battle, it was the longest in the war, lasted from February until Christmas of 1916. And it was a German offensive. The Germans were trying to, once again, to get to France and end the war quickly. And Verdun was an interesting city. It's on the River Meuse, and it basically was, we call it a salient. A salient was a city that sticks out into enemy territory. So if Germany controls this area, it's, Verdun was kind of sticking into their territory, but it was pretty well fortified. And so the idea that the Germans had was to just keep bombarding, just keep at it, be relentless. And eventually the French will lose so many casualties that they will give up their positions. This, again, was the first place where mustard gas was used. So that was another part of their technique. Just launch mustard gas into those trenches and, do away with them hundreds by hundreds. The two generals then of the French were Pétain and Nivelle. Pétain and Nivelle are two famous generals from this battle, and they both get credit for a slogan or a rallying cry that they gave, and I'll get to that in a second. But Pétain and Nivelle, we need to know those two names as generals for the French. So in 6 days, the French launched 2 million shells, and the Germans are giving it right back. Over the course of this battle, it's hard to call it a battle. It's like a war in itself. From February till December, 700,000 casualties on both sides were the cost, and 200,000 died. So massive, massive losses in this battle. Now, Pétain, he told his troops in April, he said, "Courage, we will get them." So, propaganda and slogans, even pack up your troubles in your old kit bag. Things like that were actually meaningful to the troops and kept them going when it was just a nightmare. So Nivelle, he is the one who actually said, "They shall not pass." Think of Lord of the Rings. Think of Gandalf. If you've ever read the book or seen the movie, he's standing and there's a Balrog, this fire demon, who is seeking to get the journeyers, the travelers, including the hobbits, okay? And he says, "You shall not pass." And I just think of Nivelle and Pétain saying that to their troops and saying that, they shall not pass. Those Germans will not get any further into French territory. This we would call a war of attrition. And this is what the Germans were counting on. Attrition means to lose people. You're losing soldiers by being wounded or dead. And so gradually they figured they had enough time, had enough weapons. The ratio they were losing compared to the French was pretty good in June, but then things started to change. And the French brought in more guns, and gradually the Germans were the ones losing more and more and more. And at the end of the war, they had lost 2-1, what the French had lost. So one thing that happened in Verdun was it created a toxic wasteland. And this is reflected in many poems from that period. The trees look like tangled nightmare bushes, something out of a bad Dr. Seuss book. And so please know that the Battle of Verdun was a complete nightmare, and we need to not forget the destruction that that war caused. Now, why did things change at the Battle of Verdun? Well, a big part of it was because the British and French launched their own offensive. And really, they wanted to end the war quickly. Everybody wanted to end the war quickly, and they were willing to put people in harm's way to do so. And this is where incredible heroism was shown. So it happened in July 1916. So compared to Verdun, where it's all year, the battle at the Somme was July 1st. In fact, on the first day, there were 50,000 British casualties. Remember Kitchener's army? We'll talk about them because they were the ones who came to the Somme, and they were untested, and 50,000 soldiers were casualties. 20,000 died on one day. So that was the Somme. J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, they both fought at the Somme. They didn't know each other at that time, but they would afterwards, and they would become close friends, and J.R.R. Tolkien would lead C.S. Lewis to see the light, and they would both write about their eternal hope coming out of that nightmare. Well, 3 million fought at the Somme. 3 million, and 1 million were wounded or killed. Unbelievable casualties. It was the first time that air power and tanks were used, and basically, you have this battle. The Somme is in there's Flanders in the north, and there's Verdun, and there's the Somme, and then there's Verdun. So Flanders, the Somme, and Verdun. 3 battle sites basically along the line that had developed. And remember, the Germans are just seeking to get in and take Paris and end the war, and the Allies are just pushing the other way. So the Battle of the Somme ended as a victory for the Allies, and the Allies advanced further than they ever had. Still not quite pushing the Germans out of France, but that would come in just a matter of, it was still another 2 years before the war would end, but it was a huge turning point. So we've said repeatedly that there were 2 fronts. There was an eastern front and a western front. The eastern front was basically between Austria-Hungary and Russia, and the western front was between France and Britain in the north, and France and then Germany. And it ended up being a stalemate. The war that was supposed to be done by Christmas of 1914 lasted until 1918. There's a famous book that was written called All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Remarque. Erich Remarque was a German. He writes from the German perspective, and he talks about the misery that the Germans were going through. And this is profound because it's a book that was read in English. And so empathizing with the enemy was something that wasn't happening during the war, and gradually people would come to understand that this had been a similar experience on both sides. Where was the U.S.? Why wasn't the U.S. involved as the democracy that was supposed to be a champion of other countries? Well, First of all, the U.S. wanted to remain neutral, and Woodrow Wilson had kept the U.S. out of the war because he knew of the bloodshed. He knew what was going on. He had the numbers that the American people didn't have, and he was trying to save American lives. And he, believed that this wasn't America's war. The problem was that the people in America had immigrated from Europe, so many of them. And as a result, they identified with different groups, with Germans or with British and French. And so this is a case where America is being torn apart. And in 1915, the Lusitania was sunk by a U-boat, and 1,000 people died. It sank in 20 minutes. And 120 plus were Americans. As a result, Americans became infuriated. They thought of the Germans as pirates and murderers, and they wanted the United States to do something. But Wilson, again, he's trying to protect American lives, and so at first it was just diplomatic. The U.S. said we will not, we will boycott certain products and stop trade and things like that, but that wasn't going to last. And I think even he saw that this was going to be an impossibility. And finally, after in 1917, there was the discovery that a telegram had been sent by Foreign Secretary Zimmerman from Germany to the secretary in Mexico, basically saying, hey, let's make a deal. If you help us in the war and fight against the U.S., then we'll give you Texas and New Mexico, and we'll call it good. That was the final straw, the final nail, and the U.S. entered the war. And when U.S. soldiers came to support the war effort, the French nicknamed them the Doughboys because they had circles on their uniforms. The buttons looked like donuts, and that's why they were called the Doughboys. And there was a lot of affection for these Americans coming in, even though they hadn't suffered through the first part of the war. But this is what would be the turning of the tide. I think most people understand that it changed the war dynamic. There were only 1.5 million. Let me say this. There were only about 500,000 troops at the beginning of the war in the U.S., but by the end of the war, there were 4 million. And so these resources would be put together by the U.S. and used against Germany and Austria-Hungary. And so Germany realized we need to end the war as quickly as we can. And so they stepped it up and they pushed again, and they were able to win some battles in a spring offensive in 1918. And again, the U.S. hadn't fully come into the war, and so they were rushing to Paris. But the Second Battle of the Marne was just as much of a miracle. And the hero of this battle was Ferdinand Foch, and FF, just like JJ, ended up being a war hero and stopping the Germans cold. And it was at that point that the Germans realized they just didn't have enough left. They had lost so many casualties at the Somme and Verdun and other offensives that the Allies had carried out. Even though they had been winning some victories, it wasn't enough. So it's not right to say that Germany lost. It's that they couldn't win. And finally, they did retreat. And that will lead us to the final installment of this Trenches unit. I feel like we went super fast through World War I in actuality, but you can see that this is something that took a long time to develop. And even though the fighting is done for now, we know that this is not the end. And it's important to understand the big picture. Thanks for watching. I hope this has helped.